So chapter 2 is about the theories of development. And of course, every good science will have theories that support um, their contentions. So let's talk about theories. Developmental theories group ideas or assumptions and generalizations that interpret and illuminate the thousands of observations that have been made about human growth. They provide, in a sense, a framework for understanding how and why people change as they grow older. So it kind of guides your thinking to some extent. Theories produce hypotheses, that is, things we're going to study. They generate discoveries, and theories offer practical guidance because as nurses or doctors or psychologists, clinicians, you're going to want some practical guidance. The major grand theories, I'm not sure how grand they are as far as elegance, but they're the big ones, include the psychoanalytic or often called psychodynamic theory, the behavioral theory, and the cognitive theory. And actually, behavioral and cognitive have sort of joined forces together, but they're the big three. And the characteristics that makes them grand, I suppose, is that they're comprehensive, they're enduring, that is, they don't disappear, and they're pretty much widely applied to everything. So the first grand theory, psychodynamic theory about Freud, proposes that irrational unconscious drives, the unconscious being that you're not aware of them, and motives often originate in childhood and underlie human development. And this was the academic work of Sigmund Freud. He proposed 5 psychosexual stages during which sensual satisfaction, that is linked to sex organs, is linked to developmental needs and conflicts. He suggests that early conflict resolution determines personality patterns. And he was the first psychologist to come up with a 3-part theory of the personality, the ego, the id, and the superego. So Erik Erikson was a classically trained analyst who was actually trained by Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter. And he differed from Freud, who had 5 stages. There were the oral, the anal, so Erikson's differed from Freud in that his 5 stages, the oral, the anal, the latency, the phallic, and the genital stages. He added 3 additional stages. He went beyond childhood into adulthood. Okay, so those are, and there were some other more technical things. If you're interested in psychodynamic theory, take personality psychology, which I teach in the fall as well. So you can compare the two. They're essentially very different in that if you look at Erikson's stages, they weren't based on sexual drive. They were based more on psychosocial crises. So what things does a child have to conquer before they can move from one stage to the next? A much more palatable theory, and of course it makes more common sense than Freud's does. Now, learning theory is another grand theory, but from my experience over the last 40 years, it's really not much of a theory of development. It's based mostly on the consequence of behavior, and there's basically three types. Classical conditioning, where learning occurs through association. So, for example, you've all heard of Pavlov's dog salivating when he heard the experimenter come into the laboratory. Operant conditioning, which wasn't Pavlovian, but it was more B.F. Skinner. Learning occurs through reinforcement and punishments. So you remember the feeling you get when you get an A on a paper as opposed to a D. And social learning theory, the brainchild of Albert Bandura at Stanford, And basically says that people learn through modeling, watching other people do things. Learning how to speak is a good example. So conditioning happens. It proposes that it takes place through the process by which responses are linked to particular stimuli. This, by the way, is unconscious as well. You don't have to know that this is going on, which is different than the third grand theory we're going to talk about in a minute. It focuses on observable behavior and describes the laws and processes by which behavior is learned. Learning theory, by the way, is far more scientific than psychoanalytic because it's actually testable, whereas psychodynamics not. Famous theorists include John Watson, who was the first, one of the first members of the American Psychological Association. He taught at the University of Chicago and Columbia University. He argued that scientists should examine only what they can observe and measure. Proposed anything can be learned with focus on behavior, and no specific stages are required, which is really interesting because it's very different than Erikson and Freud. There were others like Ivan Pavlov, who I mentioned won the Nobel Prize for his classical conditioning. Ironically, he didn't win the Nobel Prize for his research on classical conditioning, but he spent his acceptance speech talking about it. Classically conditioned things include, for example, phobias, pairing an aversive situation with a stimulus, and really it's very difficult to change. And then, of course, there was Albert Bandura that I mentioned. Skinner was a very famous, probably the most famous American psychologist who really laid down the groundwork of how to apply learning principles to humans, of course, starting with rats and pigeons, and even his own daughter. And of course, Skinner was almost single-handedly responsible for the idea of giving people reinforcements in school, like grades. It increases their behavior. Here's a picture of B.F. Skinner with his daughter conditioning her. Boy, think about the ethical issues involved with that. And here's a comparison of the three. Incidentally, social learning theory occurs when you watch people do something. So if you've never changed a tire, never gotten reinforced or frightened by doing it, and then one day were able to do it when you got a flat tire, you must have learned it somewhere or observed it. And this is sort of the black sheep of the learning family because it implies that something's going on out of your awareness. And then, of course, there's other grand theories that include the cognitive theory, as proposed by Jean Piaget. Little known in the United States. He proposed that thoughts and expectations profoundly affect actions, attitudes, and beliefs and assumptions, and these things change over time. Essentially, Piaget studied his own children, and it wasn't what they could do that he studied, it was what kinds of mistakes they made. And he maintained that cognitive development occurs in 4 major stages, and it occurs cognitively more than physically, that there's this drive to reach an equilibrium. John Piaget became very popular when I was in graduate school in the 1970s. It happens through a process of assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is taking experiences and interpreting it to fit into or assimilate with your old ideas. And when you do that, you accommodate, you modify or restructure the old idea to include the new experience. Sort of like an upward spiral. So we want to have a state of cognitive equilibrium, of mental balance, no confusion. New ideas through past ideas are interpreted, and we need intellectual advancement. So it's always important that we get equilibrium. We don't like disequilibrium. So when things don't seem to match up, it causes a state of wanting to get them to match. The 4 stages that Piaget talked about include the sensory motor stage, where the life revolves around sensing and moving. And of course, this is really important in the first 2 years of life. The pre-operational stage between 2 and 6, when children begin to think symbolically and use language. They become very egocentric. We can talk about this later if you'd like. Concrete operation stage between 6 and 11, where kids understand and start applying logic, although initially it's difficult. They become better and better as they go. And beyond 12 years into adulthood, called formal operations, where adolescents have deep thoughts. They use abstract and hypothetical concepts, hopefully, and they begin to analyze things. There's even another stage called post-formal thinking, but that wasn't Piagetian. Another cognitive theory is the information processing theory that likens human brains and humans to computers. They analyze data, including sensory input, connections, stored memories, and of course output. And wouldn't you know it, that information processing theory became very popular back in the 1970s and 80s when personal computers hit the scene. And of course, this just shows that people do think. You can see the difference between kids with adults with childhood ADHD and ones that don't have it. This really is key. More important than anything, the slide shows that when people do think, there is brain activity. So it kind of pokes a hole in the whole idea of learning not being just a matter of consequences. There are some criticisms of these grand theories. Many psychologists reject psychoanalytic theory outright. It's unscientific, not testable. Others reject behaviorism as a demeaning look at human potential. But they both made big contributions and led to a profound effect on the field of psychology. Newer theories are more multicultural. They take into consideration the differences between groups of people. They're multidisciplinary. Boy, this sounds familiar. We talked about the theories in general in the first chapter are most closely tied to current view of science and human development and include sociocultural, like Vygotsky, and universal theory. Speaking of Vygotsky, remember he talked about the interaction between culture and education, that our culture basically teaches us how to be citizens in whatever culture we live in, and really that we do apprentices in how to learn how to think. He talked about zones of proximal development, that we learn skills, knowledge, and concepts that learners is close to acquiring but cannot master without help. So basically the helper or the parent or the model helps them through a process of joint construction where they learn together as a mentor. So if you've ever done an internship in a job or for a class, that's kind of what they're talking about. The sociocultural perspective is not as something external that impinges on developing person, but is integral to their development in everyday life via social influences. It influences inclusions of culture into contemporary research and sheds new light on cultural differences in many areas, including attachment, which we'll talk about later, gender, and ethnic prejudice. One other perspective that kind of cuts across all of these theories is called humanism. It stresses the potential of all human beings as good and belief that all people have the same basic needs regardless of their culture or gender. And it was, well, they give credit to Abraham Maslow here, one of the founders of humanism. It was really Carl Rogers, a very famous American psychologist, who really threw down the gauntlet and made humanism and the humanistic approach, the client-centered or person-centered approach, accessible to most therapists. You've probably seen the pyramid of needs. It's a goofy looking pyramid with 5 square levels on it. The whole idea is that you start at the bottom with meeting your basic needs, physiological needs, move up to safety and security. You need to be love and belong to some place or something. You meet both your self-esteem and the esteem of others, the people respecting you and admiring you. And then, of course, if you're free from mental illness, you become self-actualized. There's another universal perspective that cuts across all these theories, and it's an evolutionary theory. And it basically says we integrate explanations of many issues in human development, that we have two long-standing biological drives, survival and reproduction, and it proposes a concept of selective adaptation. So genetic variations can be beneficial if they promote the species surviving and you live long enough to reproduce. What theories contribute? Well, they include psychoanalytic or psychodynamic theory, behaviorism, cognitive theories, sociocultural, and universal theories. And it's important that even if you stop here and just think about this for a minute, what each contributes. 5 perspectives, of course, are listed in the table. It's a good kind of review table for you. I'm going to stop and take a look at this. And then, of course, there's the infamous eclectic approach. Most developmental psychologists take this approach, but don't be fooled. Basically, eclecticism is when you take different aspects of various theories and apply them rather than adhering to one. There's a danger in this, though. That is, you become like a plumber and you use whatever tool you need. Most eclectic therapists are anchored in one theory or another. They're open-minded to alternatives, and they understand and appreciate the complexity of human life. So while it sounds enticing, it's dangerous too. So most developmental psychologists may study Piaget, but be open-minded enough to think about Kohlberg and some other people that we'll talk about later. And that's the end of the chapter.